Hello everyone and welcome to another book recommendations video. Today's video is all about classics, and in particular classics for people who don't necessarily consider themselves classics kind of people. People who don't want to have a literature degree to enjoy a book. People who don't want to have to study the book. People who just want to pick up a book purely to enjoy it. And these are the kind of books I'm going to be recommending in this video. I did do a video about a year ago now with my personal favourite classics, and I think I mentioned in that video that I thought I would consider all of those books to be non-intimidating classics, or classics that are a lot less intimidating than you might think they are. I'll put that video somewhere on the screen in case you're interested in watching that, because I won't be talking about any of the books that I mentioned in that video in this one, even though of course I would recommend some of those books because they are my favourite classics. However, a year has gone by and I do have some new favourites, so this video is going to be a mix of those, but also a mix of perhaps books I read a long time ago that I just think are great if you're someone that doesn't want to have to study the book. So all of these books are books that you can enjoy without having to analyse them, and of course you might get more out of them through doing that, but all of them are just good stories in their own right. And I didn't personally study any of these books or read summaries or any of that. I just read them and enjoyed them for what they were, and if that's the sort of classic that you're looking for, then hopefully this video will be really helpful. I have 7 books, which is kind of a random number, but we're gonna go with it. And the first 2 are crime kind of books, crime mystery type stories, which I think is quite a good way into classics that you want to read purely for enjoyment, because they are written to be gripping and enjoyable. They're not really written to be analysed, and so I thought I would recommend a couple. Of course, we can't talk about crime and classic crime fiction without Agatha Christie, who is of course one of the most well-known and beloved crime writers. So I've got Death on the Nile here, but honestly any of her books that have movie or TV show adaptations are probably a good place to start, because you can watch those either afterwards or before or alongside to kind of follow along the story and see it visualized, which I think always helps me when reading classics, particularly for books that I'm struggling with, is when there's an adaptation that I can kind of enjoy and get a feel for the story. Death on the Nile had a movie that came out a year or 2 ago, so that's why I'm mentioning this one. In this story we follow a murder that has happened on this cruise ship that is going on a cruise down the Nile, and similarly to Murder on the Orient Express, where you have this big cast of characters who are all kind of locked in together, we have that same kind of setup, which is one of my favourite setups for a murder mystery, where it's kind of claustrophobic and all of the characters cannot escape each other. I find those much more enjoyable and gripping than the ones where they're all off in their own houses doing their own thing. And the atmosphere in this one is really good. I also don't think I guessed the ending of this one, which also makes it fun when reading a crime or mystery novel. So I would fully recommend reading Agatha Christie. Other ones that I would recommend are Murder on the Orient Express, And Then There Were None, and Crooked House, which all also have adaptations. And then also for crime classics, I would of course recommend the Sherlock Holmes books by Arthur Conan Doyle. There are so many adaptations of Sherlock Holmes. My personal favourite of course being the BBC TV show with Benedict Cumberbatch. That was just a classic for when it came out. I remember finding these 2 books a lot more enjoyable than I thought they were going to be, and a lot more gripping and fast-paced than I thought, apart from maybe it's the second one that takes a strange-ish turn. I think it's in the second one. You'll know if you've read it. It takes a bit of a weird turn. There are also a lot of Sherlock Holmes short stories that you can read as well, so I don't know how they all fit into the order of the timeline of all the books, but if you are just interested in having a bit of a taste of the writing style, you could pick one of those up before you dive into a whole book. But regardless, I think these are all quite enjoyable books. So the next 3 books are just kind of normal classics. I don't know, I don't think they necessarily fit into a genre. So the first book I want to recommend is one that had been on my to read pile for years, and I'd owned a copy of it for years, and I only just picked it up a couple of months ago and absolutely loved it, and that is North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell. I feel like there's a common thread between all of the books I'm going to talk about. I think every single one in this pile has had a movie or TV show adaptation. Probably all had BBC adaptations, so that's a really good thing for me with classics, because I really like to be able to visualize it after I've read it or before. And for this book, it was a case of I'd seen the BBC miniseries adaptation so many times. It's one of my favorite period dramas, and I always knew that I wanted to read the book and just never got to it because for some reason I thought that the book would be quite dry and slow, because the TV show is quite slow, and I thought that maybe reading that in book form would just not be quite as interesting. But even though this book is a slow book, it's definitely not fast paced. There is just so much to this story, and there were definitely times where I just didn't want to put this down, and I was fast forwarding through the pages to see when the next romantic scene would come up. And there's so many lines that I just highlighted, and I actually did annotate this book as I read through because I couldn't help myself from just wanting to make notes on this story. It's one that I think maybe you could study and analyse and would get a lot from, but I personally didn't, and I just enjoyed it for the story that it was. This is a Victorian novel that follows a young woman whose family move from the south of England to a town, industrial town in the north of England, because her father has had some kind of issues with the church. He works for the Church of England and he has some issues, and that caused him to uproot his whole family. And it's about the distinctions between the south and the north of England in this period of time. The romance has a very similar feel to Pride and Prejudice, where we have 2 very proud characters who think they know what's right, think that they are the ones who are doing the right thing, and slowly have to learn each other and slowly come to admire each other. It's a really beautiful story, and I would so recommend this. The next book is one of my favourite classics of all time. Again, I think I read since doing my favourite classics video last year, and that is Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. I think Daphne du Maurier in general is a great author to pick up if you are not a massive classics reader but want to get into some classics, because she's very readable and she writes across quite a variety of genres. So she's got sci-fi books and thrillers and mysteries and historical fiction. I think she's a good one because you could pick up a book within your kind of preferred genre and she will have probably written something within that. And Rebecca is probably her most well-known book. We follow an unnamed narrator who falls in love with a man who she meets on this trip, and she ends up going back to marry him and going to his house to learn that his previous wife sort of haunts this whole house. And it's a really kind of eerie and unsettling but gripping and just great story. I really love it, and I really love Daphne du Maurier's writing. She's very, I was going to say lyrical, it's not necessarily lyrical, but she just writes in a very descriptive and immersive way that really makes you feel the atmosphere of the story. And again, there are multiple adaptations of this story to watch as well. Next, we have what is probably my favourite classic ever as of right now, probably in my top 5 books ever, and I only just read it about 3 months ago, and that is Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. This is a big book and it's one that intimidated me for a really long time. I have had it on my shelves for years, and every time I've looked at it to go and pick it up, I've just thought, I'm not gonna like this book. It's too long, it's gonna be too slow, it's gonna be too dry. I just never really thought I was gonna actually enjoy it and read it. However, loads of people had said to me that this was their favourite classic or their favourite book ever. And I knew at one point I was gonna have to read this book. And I finally picked it up about 3 or 4 months ago, and it's amazing. The first couple of 100 pages are slow, and to a degree I do think you need to push yourself through that first bit of the story, because after a couple of 100 pages this book gets so good. This book kept me up late reading it because I was so desperate to find out what happened, and I actually ended up reading all 700 pages of it over pretty much one weekend because I was just so engrossed in the story. I did a whole reading vlog on this video, so if you want my full complete thoughts and just adoration of this book, then definitely watch that video. I think this book was a great example to me of don't be intimidated by a book's size, because this book is big for a reason and it is packed full of such a brilliant story, and it's one that I know personally I will want to reread many times. And yet again, there are adaptations of this story as well. The last 2 books that I want to talk about are actually children's classics, and I wanted to include these in here because I think there's something about children's stories in classic form that are A, much easier to read, B, full of story and adventure. Some of them of course do have themes and symbols and that sort of thing, but on the whole they are written for enjoyment and fun and adventure, not to analyse and deeply think about. So I think they are perfect for if you want a classic that you're not having to think too deeply about. That's of course not to say that you can't think deeply about these books, but I think if you are just looking for a book purely for the story, then children's classics are perfect for that in my opinion. So of course the first series that I have to mention is Anne of Green Gables. I did actually include this in my last classics video, but I wanted to include it in this one again because I have since read 3 or 4 books into the series, so I can give you a bit more of a wider perspective. This is a heartwarming, beautiful story about a young orphan named Anne and her life as she becomes adopted by this brother and sister. And the series as it goes on follows Anne as she gets older, and I think I'm at book 4 and she's an adult at this point in the story, and so it's quite nice to have a series that starts very childlike and matures and grows with the character as the series goes on, but at the same time it's full of adventure and whimsy and wonder about the world. And they are also all quite short, so very easy and quick to get through. And there is a TV series, which I haven't actually watched that much of. I've only watched a bit of the first season, so I definitely need to read that. I think I was putting it off because I wanted to read the books first, but maybe I'll read until where I have read up to. And finally, we have The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett, and this was one of my favourite books as a child, and this particular copy is full of pictures, which is one of my favourite things in children's books. We have a secret garden and a magical boy and talking animals, and it's very sweet and charming. And the other thing that I really like about children's classics is that they tend to have some very obvious messages that they're trying to portray that, you know, you can't really miss them. And I think there's something really nice as an adult about reading those messages and applying them to your life that, I don't know, I think there's things that you forget about when you grow up and forget to really think about that children's books can remind you of in a simple and beautiful way. I think this is also a great book for springtime if you like to seasonally read, which is something I do, and it's, yeah, beautiful and charming. So those are just a few recommendations for classics to enjoy, just to enjoy the story, not to analyse or study or think too deeply about. Let me know if you pick up any of these books and if you enjoy them. Also, let me know your classic book recommendations that you think are perfect just for the pure enjoyment and brilliance of the story, not because of how deeply you have to study it. I would love to know your book recommendations, share them with each other. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a wonderful day wherever you are, and I'll see you very soon with another video.